I mean, even in absolute silence, there's sound. John Cage was famously in this anechoic chamber. I can never say that word, but this room where there's no sound, but he started hearing the vibration of his own electrical system in his body. And most of us, at a certain age, have a little bit of tinnitus, so we're always hearing that little buzz in our ears. So there's always sound around us, and if you're just hearing it, it's not necessarily music, but if you're listening to it, it can be music. And that way, when you hear a skateboarder going by, you can hear that as like the rhythm section. When it goes clunk, 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 clunk across the sidewalk. And then like the steam vents and air conditioners, they make a hum. They can make harmony. And just bird songs and people talking. That all becomes this kind of wonderful tapestry of sound that is music. Well, my definition of music is the conscious use of sound for expression. And that means consciously you have to be aware that you're trying to express something. And the range of human expression is huge. And that kind of gets to the idea of deep listening instead of hearing. Hearing is sort of an unconscious act. We hear stuff all day long. But when we listen to something, we actually are thinking about what we're hearing in a much deeper level. And so if I'm thinking about composing, some people say, well, music is organized sound. And that's kind of a definition, but a factory is organized sound too. It's not music unless you want to hear it as music. It's like, I think one of the coolest sounds is when one of the big buses comes to a stop and all the hydraulics are going and the brakes are squeaking and the motor is running. So I like to just sit out there and listen to buses dropping people off. And I listen to it as if it were like some sort of mechanical orchestra. One way to kind of experience that kind of thing where sound becomes music is just to go on a sound walk. And when you step out the door, you say, everything I'm going to be hearing, I'm going to interpret as music. Susan Langer, I don't know if you know her, she's a philosopher. She talked about music as being basically a metaphor for sound or a metaphor for expression. It's not an exact thing. So some people will, when you're in like elementary school and they're teaching you about major and minor chords, and minor chords are sad and major chords are happy, but that's not really true. They're just chords, right? So music is sort of a morphology of these feelings. It's not something we can say exactly, like the exact feeling I'm trying to express. It's a lot more abstract than that. It's kind of like, you know, when the Supreme Court defined pornography, you know it when you see it. That's kind of how you have to be as a composer. It's like, oh, that's what I was looking for. That's the sound I want. I guess for me, when I'm inspired by a landscape, for example, I try to make sounds that help me imagine that landscape when I'm not around it. So I like to make evocative sounds that sort of conjure up images. When I was young, my family moved to Zurich, Switzerland, and the radio stations there back in the 60s were really eclectic. And what I really liked, what really hit me was like the Beethoven symphonies and some of the other classical and romantic composers. That music really reminded me of the Alps, because we traveled a lot in the Alps. And so when I would hear that music, I would just see the Alps in my head. So if I was bored and I wanted to go to the Alps, I would just make up a symphony in my head and see the mountains. So there are a lot of places. Another place that that I have a memory of is growing up in Montana in the winter, going to get a Christmas tree. My dad was at work and my mom didn't want to go out in the snow. So I went out behind our house. We lived up in the mountains. We went up this gulch called School Gulch, and the snow was coming down so heavily that it just muted out all sound, except for a little bit of the wind blowing through the trees. And so that inspired a piece called School Gulch Winter. But I'm also inspired by paintings. So my second symphony was inspired by 3 paintings of George O'Keeffe and 2 by Russell Chatham, who was a Montana artist. So I like pieces like From the Far Away Nearby. That inspired a piece for solo bass clarinet and electronics.
What specifically inspired you from that painting?
Just the sort of juxtaposition of the 2 objects. I don't know if you know that painting, but there's like sort of a reddish sand hill, and above it is a deer skull. And there's no perspective. They're both in the same kind of plane. And that always kind of caught my imagination.
So what kind of specific sounds were inspired by the different parts of it?
I think it was just this kind of image I had of the far away and nearby. That piece uses a lot of really long decaying reverb. And so you don't really get a sense of where you are in the space. So I basically really change the physicalness of the room that you listen to it in, or that it's performed in. Suddenly it becomes this big cavernous hall.